Reality Check with Ross Montour.
400 years of settler history expounding the truth on the Dick Pound affair. The Dick Pound fiasco of the last week or so teaches nothing if not that at best ethnocentricity and at worst racism is alive and well at all strata of Canadian civilization. What does it tell us when no less than a chancellor of McGill University can, in defense of his involvement with the repressive Chinese government as a member of the International Olympic Committee, compares China to the indigenous societies of this land 400 years ago and describes us as savages surrounding only 10,000 or so civilized Europeans? What does it tell us that he is chided in the National Post by columnist Margaret Went only for being stupid enough to be caught expressing his inner man publicly? What does it mean that in defending Pound, Went reveals herself to be of the same twisted mental moral bent? It speaks volumes. When Went casts herself in the role of Pound's chief apologist, she invokes the names of other such presumably enlightened thinkers as Francis Widdowson and Albert Howard, authors of an impressive new book on Aboriginal policy and culture, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, that knocks the stuffing out of the prevailing mythology that surrounds the history of First Peoples. It means that the Dick Pounds of this world will be defended to the nth degree. How can Pound's racism be possibly defended? The answer to that question is with more of the same. According to Went, Widdowson and Howard hold the keys of truth and reason. And just what is that truth? According to Went, the truth is different from what Indian lovers would have you believe. North American Native peoples had a Neolithic culture that is stone-aged, based on subsistence living and small kinship groups. They had not developed broader laws or institutions, or a written language, evidence-based science, mathematics, or advanced technologies. Continuing to quote Howard and Widdowson, Went goes on to write, the kinship groups in which they lived were very small, simple, organized, and not very productive. Other kinship groups were regarded as enemies, and the homicide rate was probably very high. Never in history has the cultural gap between two peoples coming into contact with each other been wider. Went proclaims, like a small toddler proudly showing mommy her freshly deposited stool in the potty, that until 30 years ago, the anthropological term for this developmental stage of contact period Aboriginal societies was savagery. Indeed, that must make it okay then, doesn't it? One thing is certain, from our perspective, is that the homicide rate exploded when the Europeans arrived on our shores. Increased, and that is called genocide. That is to say, mass race-based murder. How civilized indeed. How civilized indeed that those very settlers who stumbled as hungry castaways upon our shores were welcomed and fed and nurtured to the point of overcoming us. How vastly superior those people were that in coming to our shores seeking their religious freedom, that within a generation or two they commenced to burning their mothers, sisters, and daughters at the stake for the practice of witchcraft. On a roll, Went argues, as if to surpass Pound, that it is foolish and not very productive to continue on with the delusional thought that somehow native societies were anywhere equal to those of the settlers. She goes on to essentially ridicule governments or universities that might seek out traditional knowledge from native elders. She bemoans the misguided belief that the solution to the problems facing Aboriginal peoples is to be found in the revival and preservation of native culture on a separate but equal track. According to Went, Widdowson became disillusioned with her previous life as a Northern policy analyst in favor of a career in academia, where she has been the lonely voice of sanity in a world where native spirituality and traditional knowledge are held to be just as valid as Western science. Went argues that her people have gone overboard in the romanticization of indigenous cultures, so much so that they are often described, especially in Native studies courses, as morally superior, more egalitarian, more spiritual, more peaceful, and more ecologically minded than the rest of us, Euro-settler Canadians. According to Went's heroine Widdowson, it's hard to hurt the environment with a stone axe. Claims about Aboriginal contributions to civilization are also vastly overstated, Wentz writes. How did the Iroquois Confederacy really influence the Declaration of Independence? Sorry, no, she writes. Actually, Miss Went, you're right about that, but it makes you no less an ass than pound, because it was not the Declaration of Independence, but rather the drafting of the U.S. Constitution that Benjamin Franklin urged the Founding Fathers to look to when drafting that Constitution. Do native medicinal herbs play an important role in modern drugs? No, according to her, yet some leading intellectuals try to argue otherwise. One wonders whether Went has ever heard of or taken an aspirin or two to ease the things that pain her elevated, vastly superior cultural sensibilities. It is also hard to cure the plague or any other such disease with a leech, Mrs. Widdowson and Went. Such delusional thinking does nothing, she says, to elevate indigenous people from their Neolithic superstitions or to assist them to rise to the ideal of civilized life. But a Neolithic culture cannot possibly give them a future, and it's time for us, white people, to face that. The existing policy direction is so harmful, Widdowson posits. Aboriginal people are people like anyone else. They deserve to interact with the modern world like anyone else. It doesn't mean that you're a racist or a colonist if you recognize there's a cultural gap. But to say that Aboriginal were just as sophisticated as Europeans, that's just nonsense. Well, yes, you are to both, Mrs. Widdowson and Went. You are racist. Went, Pound, Widdowson et al. Are nothing more or less than racist. That said, they, in any truly sane, civilized world, would be fired for fomenting hateful attitudes. But then we don't live in a sane world, do we? Now that is a reality check.